In environmental earth science, this week we'll focus on Earth systems and human population, covering some of the material from Chapter 1 of your textbook, which you should be reading. In the first lecture this week, we covered the learning outcome that you should be able to identify the major themes of environmental earth science as a field of study. In this lecture, we'll cover learning outcomes 2 and 3. You should be able to describe how Earth operates as a system and why humans are an integral part of the system, and explain how geologic time and the rate at which natural processes operate affect how humans respond to environmental issues. In Lecture 3, we will explain the concept of exponential population growth and how it relates to resource use, and define the concepts of sustainability, ecological footprints, and environmental justice. First, we need to define earth science and environmental earth science. Earth science is the study of the physical, chemical, and biological processes that shape and modify the earth. We use earth science in order to understand events in the past and present, and to build predictive models of what might happen in the future. Environmental earth science uses earth science approaches to solve problems between humans and the environment. Or, as I said in the first lecture, environmental earth science is how interactions between geologic and human processes shape the Earth's environment. The Earth is comprised of 4 interconnected systems. There are 3 abiotic systems and 1 biotic system. The atmosphere is the thin gaseous layer surrounding the Earth held by gravity. Earth's water supply exists in the atmosphere, on the surface, and underground. Collectively, these areas form the hydrosphere. The geosphere is the solid portion of the Earth, composed of rocks and minerals. The biotic system, the biosphere, includes all living organisms on land, in water, in the subsurface, and in the air. Humans are part of the biosphere. All these systems interact. For example, rain falling on sand and carrying it into a river is interaction between the atmosphere, geosphere, and hydrosphere. If that sand is deposited on a floodplain and forms the soil that plants grow on, then we have interaction between the geo and biospheres. Humans are both part of the Earth system and can profoundly affect it. The way we interact with the Earth system can have major impacts on the environment upon which we depend. Let's work through an example of Earth system interactions that start with a human intervention. In the Pacific Northwest, there are dozens of dams on the Columbia River and the rivers that feed into it. These dams were built to generate electricity, reduce flooding, and increase navigation for the transport of agricultural and mineral products from as far inland as Idaho. By changing the seasonal flow patterns of the Columbia River, the dams affect the hydrosphere. But since the dams are also major power supplies, the Pacific Northwest is less dependent on fossil fuels for electricity, and there is less air pollution associated with energy production, thus affecting the atmosphere. Dams, being walls in a river, also trap the sediment that is naturally carried by the Columbia and its feeder rivers. That sediment is part of the geosphere. The dams also block the movement of fish, especially salmon, which migrates between freshwater and the ocean, so the biosphere is also affected. And of course, people are affected as they use the navigation system and power supply, are less exposed to flood risks, but are also less able to sustain natural salmon populations. This is an example of how effects can cascade from one system to another. A seemingly simple decision like, let's build a dam to decrease flooding, ultimately affects multiple Earth systems. People have the unique agency to understand these system interactions and their cascading interactions, and to make decisions about what happens next. In the Pacific Northwest and in other regions, some people advocate for removing dams in order to restore fish populations and the natural movement of sediment and water. Other people think we should build more dams as a low pollution energy source. When we make decisions about how to use Earth resources, we either explicitly or implicitly are thinking about risk. Risk is the chance that an event, or the outcome of a decision, will be negative for an individual or society. It is a function of how likely the outcome is, multiplied by how severe the consequences are likely to be. Going back to our example with dams in the Pacific Northwest. When the dams were designed, engineers thought about the extremely severe consequences if a dam were to fail or collapse. So they engineered the dam to make the probability of that happening extremely rare, making the overall risk of dam failure low. But the dam builders didn't know about or didn't calculate the risk that some salmon species would go extinct because access to their breeding grounds would be blocked by the dams. So they didn't engineer ways for the fish to get around all of the dams. This is an example of an unintended consequence or unforeseen risk. The perception of risk of a given environmental process is also dependent on the timescale involved. Some processes are sporadic, with big effects when they happen, but they don't happen all the time. For these types of processes, the way we plan for and react to events that happen frequently is different from the way we plan for and react to events that happen infrequently. In the Pacific Northwest, river floods happen every few years, and so we have flood control dams and have zoning to keep people from building in the floodplain. But the Pacific Northwest also has devastating tsunami every few hundred years. And even though the consequences of the tsunami are severe, the probability in any one year is low. So people continue to build homes and communities in low-lying areas along the coast. In contrast to sporadic events, incremental events result in slow but steady change. From year to year, the amount of change may seem minimal, but over a longer time period, the amount of change can actually be quite substantial. For incremental processes, if the perception is that the effect of the process is minimal from year to year, the response may not be adequate to address the problem over a longer time period. Many of the environmental earth science problems that we will be talking about this semester are the result of incremental processes where humans have either not understood or they have discounted the overall risk of their decisions. One factor that makes it hard for people to adequately think about risk during decision making is how slow Earth processes are and how old the Earth is. The Earth is really, really old. It was formed more than 4.5 billion years ago. This is a depiction of geologic time as if it were a clock. So we go from the oldest events clockwise towards the most recent events. So while the Earth was formed more than 4.5 billion years ago, life appeared more than 3 billion years ago, but the first multicellular life appeared only about 600 million years ago. And humans did not appear until about 2 million years ago. If Earth history were really a 24-hour clock, humans appeared about 1 second before midnight. And most of what we'll be talking about are interactions between humans and the Earth over the last few hundred years, a millisecond in geologic time. But even though we'll be focused on the very recent past, the earth science processes that we will be studying have been operating for all of Earth history. For example, mineral resources and fossil fuels have been around on Earth for a lot longer than humans. Because they have seemingly always been there to our human minds and our actions make only incremental change, we may not always do a good job of fully thinking about the risks of our actions and decisions.